or how does dollar dominance shape geopolitical power? And can you elaborate on the relationship between the US dollar and the concept of empire?
Sure. So again, if you look at all empires, what you see is efforts to establish the priority, the sovereignty of the cores, the central states' laws over peripheries. You see the effort to establish the central state's money as the highest powered money, even if local currencies persist. And so this is where you see the, again, heterogeneity and asymmetry. If you looked at the British Empire, for example, you would see that banks kept books and British, uh, I don't want to really say transnational corporations because
Mm,
they weren't quite that, but
mm,
British offshore corporations kept their books in pounds sterling.
mm,
But the banks and the corporations out in the periphery often would operate with local currencies.
mm,
So there was a Canadian dollar in the 19th century, even though the big banks like Bank of Montreal would keep their books in sterling.
mm,
There was an Australian pound in the 19th century, um, or different Australian pounds
mm,
because there was no unified Australia. But there was an Australian pound in the 19th century, but the big banks kept their books in sterling.
mm,
And then here you see critically the not just the asymmetry, where the asymmetry is in a crisis, everyone would want to run from Canadian dollars to sterling or
mm,
run from Australian pounds to British pounds. But in the non-white colonies and the non-settler colonies, you had local monies operating that were backed by silver rather than gold, and they were sealed off. So there was a West Indian um, pound, there was an Indian rupee, there was an East African and West African pounds, and these currencies didn't circulate globally. They only circulated inside those zones, and because they were denominated in sterling, they typically would depreciate slowly over time relative to the pound. And so there you see the central money being the highest powered money.
mm,
And we have the same thing today. Um, if you look globally, of course, it's no surprise that no one in Paraguay wants to hold Paraguayan pesos and that they prefer to hold dollars. It's less surprising that you have countries that are fully dollarized, like Ecuador, where there is no local currency.
mm,
Um, right? Those are not surprising to us because in our imagination, we see these as countries with uh, states that have low state capacity. They can't tax, they can't enforce their own rules. But what is very surprising, I think, and what most people don't realize is that even rich, highly developed countries like or financial zones like the Eurozone, or Japan or Korea are enmeshed in a set of relationships in which the dollar is the highest powered uh, currency.
mm,
Now, two things here for the audience. Um, the first is that when you think about money, you probably think about piles of cash in a warehouse, like in Breaking Bad, or you think about your wallet. And that's the wrong way to think about money. Um, the better way to think about money is that money is a form of credit,
mm,
and credit is a claim on future behavior. So it is a source of power. And credit is a source of power because credit always involves both an asset and a debt, an asset and a liability. And the debtor, the one who has the liability, is the one whose behavior is being compelled. The asset owner is the recipient of whatever that behavior might be. You owe me, let's say for the sake of argument for this podcast, you owe me 100,000 Swedish crowns. And I can take that out as research assistance or maybe buy all those books I see behind you.
mm,
But this is a way for me to compel your behavior.
mm,
So the way to think about money is to think about credit, which is again assets and liabilities. Um, and not all credit has the same degree of acceptability. The famous American economist Hyman Minsky once said, anyone can create money. The problem is getting it accepted. So what that means is an airline like SAS or an airline like United can create Euro bonus points
mm,
or frequent flyer miles, and they're a kind of money. It's a claim on future behavior. I can take my United frequent flyer miles and translate them into a better seat on the airplane or translate them into a flight, right? So there's a debt from United to me, but I can't take those frequent flyer miles down to the grocery store and exchange them for bananas,
mm,
right? So not all money is equally acceptable. And when you look at the acceptability of global credit, global debts, what you see is there's a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is, again, heterogeneous and asymmetric.
mm,
So how do we see this? The way we see this is in crisis, which is when all is revealed. And in every crisis except the current one, we see an asymmetry and a hierarchy and heterogeneity, which is that it is other people's banks and other people's central banks that come to the US Federal Reserve for help, not the other way around.
mm,
So why is that? Well, here's where we can see the centrality of the dollar.
mm,
About 50% of global trade is invoiced in dollars. And what that means is the price is of the good is, expressed in US dollars. And since all trade is financed with some kind of debt, right? Because if you're buying it, you borrow money to buy it. If you're producing it, you borrow money to produce it. If you're shipping it, you're borrowing money for bonding, for insurance, for foreign exchange hedging.
mm,
You're borrowing in dollars to reduce your risks.
mhm,
So 50% of global trade invoiced in dollars. Probably that means 70% of global trade outside of the Eurozone, which I think is actually the accurate way to measure it.
mm,
Second, 60 or so percent of global cross-border lending is in dollars. Almost all of that is done by non-US banks. So again, here's the connection with the first thing I said, which is trade. What are those banks doing? Well, they're generating trade finance.
mm,
They're speculating in global foreign exchange markets. And so we're talking about a big number here.
mm,
At any given time, there's between 13 and 15 trillion dollars of outstanding debt, net of derivatives, outstanding debt in the world financial system. That is denominated in dollars. And what that translates to for an individual bank is something like 30% of their cross-border lending is denominated in dollars.
mhm,
And this creates a vulnerability for those banks.
mm,
If you're a US bank, actually, 95% of your cross-border lending is denominated in dollars. So there's an asymmetry there. The second asymmetry is, okay, what happens if I get into trouble? From a bank's point of view, lending is an activity in which they simultaneously create an asset for themselves and a liability.
mm,
When banks create money, which is what they do, they make a loan to somebody, and on their balance sheet, what you would see is here's an asset, the borrower owes me money, but on the other side is a deposit, which is the funding of that loan, which is now a liability to the bank because it's money they've promised to the borrower.
mm,
Now, with a lot of banks, the deposits all get mixed up, but fundamentally, from the bank's point of view, they have to have deposits that match those assets
mm,
to have a balanced balance sheet. And in a time of crisis, what happens is the value of assets decreases. That's what causes the crisis. But the liability to the bank for deposits doesn't decrease. Okay. That's the basic structure behind bank crises. So if 30% of your balance sheet, if you're a non-US bank and 30% of your balance sheet is dollar denominated and there's a crisis, how do you get out of the crisis? How do you get fixed? Well, the way you usually get fixed in a crisis is the central bank comes in, buys up the assets at face value. And in doing so, you now have the cash on your balance sheet to match your liabilities for to the depositors.
mm,
And at a domestic level, that works very easily. The central bank comes in, they give you dollars, euro, whatever it is, it matches your liability. But for those 30% of your balance sheet for non-US banks that are in dollars, the relevant central bank, like the European Central Bank or the Bank of England, et cetera, cannot come in and buy those assets with dollars because they don't have dollars.
Hmm.
So in these global financial crises, what happens is the US Fed loans money to everybody else's central banks.
Hmm.
Then those central banks can buy the assets with dollars. Now the banks are rescued. Assets, cash on hand, matches deposits, cash that might go out, the liability side. And so there's a deep asymmetry, and that's how you know that the US dollar is at the top. The last thing here is heterogeneity. So I just said, well, the Federal Reserve loans money to other people's central banks, but they don't lend money to everybody. If you look at the structure of swaps, what you see is there are four distinct categories of access to the Fed. At the very top, there are five central banks that have unlimited, unconditional access to dollars. And that's the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, the European Central Bank, the Swiss National Bank, and the European Central Bank. Then there's a second level, which is nine countries that are a little bit less systemically important, but are still pretty important to the US in one way or another. They have unconditional access, meaning they can go and borrow the money, but it's not unlimited. It varies from 30 to 60 billion dollars. And those nine countries are the three Scandinavian central banks, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Korea, and then two countries that are geopolitically important to the US, but clearly different from the others, Mexico and Brazil. Second tier. Third tier is countries that have conditional and limited access, right? So they're already, oh, maybe you'll get the money, and how much money you get is a function of what you bring to the table as collateral. And these are the countries that can come to the FIMA, Foreign and International Monetary Authority, repo line. In a repo, what happens is you have an asset, you swap it for cash, and you promise to buy the asset back. Why do you need cash? Maybe you have an immediate need for liquidity, and the asset isn't really liquid. In this case, the asset you can bring to the Fed is US Treasury bond. So if you're not one of those 14 countries that have unconditional access and you need dollars to bail out your banks, you can only get dollars if the Fed is willing to do the repo with you, the repossession agreement, and you only get as much money as you bring treasuries to the table. So if you have $100 million in treasuries, you can get $100 million of cash. But if you have only $50 million of treasuries, you're only getting $50 million. And then the last group are those that don't have any treasuries. They can't go to the repo, to the FEMA repo facility. And so they're on the mercy of the World Bank, the IMF, etc. So here you see the dollar as the highest powered currency in the world economy. You see it being used pervasively by banks and other economic actors in the world economy, even when they're making loans from one non-US bank to a non-US entity, or when they're financing trade that never comes to the US, they're using dollars. When they're borrowing money for long-term development, they borrow in dollars. And when you get into trouble, it's the Fed that bails you out if you're important enough to be bailed out. So there's heterogeneity, asymmetry, and hierarchy again.